North Alabama School for Organizers presents Fireside Chats, intersectional education through interviews with the organizations and people making real change right now. Listen, learn, and organize with Nassau and Fireside Chats.
If we don't understand how the system works, and we're just out here struggling in these individual issues, then nothing's ever going to change. You know, our children, our grandchildren, 50 years from now are going to be facing the same situation, but it's or worse.
We are so blessed to have Willie Baptist and Tonny Algood with us tonight. You know, I've known both of them for a little while. Willie and I met up in New York some years ago.
Yep.
Doing a presentation, I think of. Man, I can't remember what it was. What the presentation was about, but I'm sure it had something to do.
I think it was Riverside Church over there, wasn't it? You did a presentation. And,
yeah, and we had a chance to get to know each other. And Willie has been around for a while. You know, I think you've been working with the civil rights for about 50 years now. You were formerly homeless.
Yeah, formerly homeless.
And you
I was there when God said turn off the light. I want to turn it. I turned off the light.
Hit the switch for him. All right.
Yeah. And Tonny was passing around the tray to pay the bill.
Yeah.
But we're really glad to have you here. Now, Willie you have a couple of books out or a book out. What are your books here?
Well, I did a compilation entitled "Pedagogy of the Poor" with Ron Raymond, Union Theological Seminary. We did a whole piece. We had several years. We did a joint class there at Union Theological Seminary, and the book is basically a summary of that class and some of the presentations and so on. And then I did this other book called "It's Not Enough to Be Angry." Dr. King at the centenary celebration of centenary birthday date. W. Du Bois. He talked about Du Bois in relationship to that notion that it's not enough to be angry, and that Du Bois was both a scholar and an organizer. And he was
right. Great.
So I wrote a book on that, and then just some essays and stuff over the years and stuff. Yeah.
Right. And Tonny, he's been around like us forever. You know, we're soon to be fossils in this movement. You know, we just keep moving and just keep going. And Tonny is out of Mobile, and like I said, I've known him for a couple of years now or so, and we met at I think it was a Poor People's Campaign meeting in Birmingham, and just struck up a friendship and started working together, and we kept in contact with each other, you know, for all this time, and. Tonny, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background? I know you've got a very extensive background in civil rights and, you know, and working for the poor seems to be your forte, is serving the poor. And can you just tell us a little bit about it?
Well, I'm not a native Mobilean. I wasn't born under an azalea bush, as they say down here. Originally from Mississippi. I grew up during the civil rights movement. Went off to school as a pre-ministerial student and got involved in the anti-Vietnam War movement and deeply involved in the civil rights movement. And the church was going one way and I was going the other. The Methodist Church really, from the bishop down, were opposing integration, civil rights and all. And when I finished, I went to work organizing poor black and white pulpwood haulers in Mississippi. And then from there, organizing poultry workers in Forest, Mississippi. I got to where I couldn't get a job anywhere around Forest, so I moved to Mobile, went to work at the shipyard, and that's where I first met David. And I held about every office in the union there, worked on a biracial committee dealing with discrimination in the yard. And there's some real stories behind that, because during World War II, that was about 25 years before I went to work there, when they were building so many ships, they're about rolling one off a day, that they ran short on labor and started hiring blacks as laborers, and the whites rioted, and they had to get the police and all to come in and stop the riots. And it was a lot of that same attitude when I went to work there in '74. I worked with the Alabama New South Coalition and the White Lung Association, which dealt with asbestos victims. I had brown lung for textile workers and black lung for coal miners. And from there, the shipyard closed in '89. We went into negotiations and we were making $12.42 an hour then. They said, we don't care if you work for $5 an hour, we're still gonna close the shipyard and terminate all of you. And so they did. And I went to work directing the volunteer lawyer program for indigent clients. Then after that, while I was working there, I went to law school. It took 4 years to finish. And I got out, practiced law for 4 years. And then I went to work as a pastor at the United Methodist Inner City Mission, a community where we work is about 81.2% poverty rate. And during this time too, we created the Mobile Union chapter for the homeless and worked with Willie on that. And now we're reviving all that now, because there is a growing number of homeless in this country. And they're going to be more and more, they're going to be under attack. And all during this time, I studied political economy, philosophy, and theory and all, which to me helped really ground my work and gave me a deeper understanding of how this system works, and the system that cannot exist without creating more and more poverty and fewer extremely wealthy individuals. And now I am the tri-chair of the Poor People's Campaign for the state of Alabama. And I'm also a member of the University of the Poor too, and on the executive committee of the National Union for the Homeless. I'll just stop.
Quite impressive.
Yeah.
Great.
Willie, what are you doing presently?
Well, I'm doing a number of things, but I'd like to just have people to know me in terms of just a little brief thing of my history, if you will. In 1965, August 11th, 70,000 to 100,000 people in the little community of Watts erupted. And that inaugurated a whole period of uprisings, not only in Watts, but other major cities, Detroit, Newark, and throughout the country in the black ghettos. And it largely as a consequence of the economic conditions that describe the ghetto, where youth was enduring upwards of 50-60% unemployment. And so that was quite a radicalizing experience for me as I participated in that whole struggle. That kind of awakened me to social responsibility. And when you have tanks and caravans of police with their guns out and tanks, and also, in LA they had units of the helicopter units where they had acquired the military helicopters from Vietnam, and they had used that in that whole process. So these things that was happening, the tremendous activities that described that uprising, really had left an indelible impression on me. And I'm still a student of Watts in terms of conditions that gave rise to it, the kind of responses on various levels to that whole period. That period was described as the most violent and most massive upheaval since the Civil War. That was just in the black ghettos. And I can see today that the conditions that exist there in the black community not only have worsened, but it's also existing in the white slums, also in the Latino communities, that we are living in very explosive times, because those conditions that I lived under exploded in those uprisings in that time. So I think that is something that stays on my mind and certainly shaped me. The other thing is that I was involved with the homeless union organizing drive during the 1980s and 1990s. And we organized at our height some 25 locals in 25 states. We was able to acquire a membership of anywhere between 25,000, 35,000 homeless women, men and women. And this is homeless people organizing homeless folks. We at the founding convention, for example, in Chicago, we had upwards of 800 delegates of homeless folk, individuals that met to form the Union of the Homeless in Chicago, Delaware Valley Union, not Delaware, but Gary, Indiana Union of the Homeless. And then in LA, we had over 1,000 delegates. And then New York, at the famous Riverside Church, we had over 1,200. This is homeless folks organizing homeless folks. We organized several housing takeovers throughout the country, synchronized housing takeover. In 1988, we had a take off the board campaign where some 73 cities participated simultaneously. This is, again, homeless workers organizing themselves and so on. So these things shape me and my involvement with the homeless issue, because I lived on the streets of Philadelphia homeless for about a year, and was involved with the homeless union organizing, and those things shape me. There's a lot of other things that happen, but those are the things I want to really mention, because what Tonny was saying of the rebirth of the homeless union, and because the homeless crisis in this country is being exacerbated, and it's continuing in the richest country in the world. Out of that experience of the homeless union organizing, because our rise and our demise really taught us not a lot. And one of the things it taught us that if we're going to defeat who we're up against, and we're going to end homelessness and poverty, we got to outsmart the people who benefit from the system. And these people are no joke. They're intelligent. And if we're going to change this system, we got to become at least as intelligent, if not more so. If we're going to there's never a time in history that a dumb force has rose up and defeated a smart force. You read any history book, and you'll never find where some dumb folks got it together and defeated some smart folks. And the people that we're dealing with are very intelligent. I mean, they have their vulnerability. It's not like they're, invincible. But to know them requires a kind of scholarship, an engaged scholarship that elevates a certain intelligence in the leadership that's absolutely required if we're going to win. So anyway, those are comments that I wanted to make at this point in our discussion. But knowing Tonny and our work together over the years, Tonny is a hero, working class hero, and we've always respected that about Tonny. I've learned a lot. He's the one that got me in this mess. So if anybody want to blame me for something, you got to look at Tonny. He's the fault. He's the culprit. But
but a good one to be that. I know his heart's really in it, and I know that you. I don't know if anybody else is having a problem with sound. I've got very low volume. Is everybody else?
Yeah, can people hear me? Because sometimes I talk loud and sometimes I talk too loud. So
it was a little low, but I just want to make sure it's not in our system.
Yeah,
I think it's just Willie. Willie, if you just bring your microphone closer,
all right,
it'll probably help.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I had to call in. That's what that bottom sound is, because my computer speaker is going out. So
okay, I'll talk up a little bit louder. But was that legible? At least some of the things I had to say.
Oh yes, very much so. It's just low volume. We can adjust that. We can work that because this is going to be re-edited and put in our library and on YouTube. Yeah. But I'm so glad to have you two gentlemen here. You're just an encyclopedia of knowledge, and it's so. I've been looking forward to this session for a while, and I know that you both are working with, as you had mentioned before, the University for the Poor.
Yeah.
How did that get started, and what is the purpose of it? Because I know with NASA, what we're doing is we're educating to organize, and we believe that people need to be educated.
Yes.
So that's where, and not to go in ignorant when they're trying to organize. Yes. So it seems to me that we have a lot of similarities here with the University of the Poor.
Yeah. Well, I think if you got your ass kicked as many times I got my ass kicked, I think that lesson is a very important lesson. And again, the people that we're dealing with, we're not shadow boxing. We're boxing real folks, and they got real strengths and real weaknesses, and they intend to maintain this system, but a system that's killing us. And so we have to change it. And to change it, we have to develop a sophistication that is least comparable to their sophistication. And what we learned through the rise and demise of the Homeless Union is that we got to create an intellectualism, and it goes along with our practical activity that's at least comparable to who we're up against. And so the University of the Poor was an idea that came upon one of our marches. We marched, we had a month march from Washington, D.C., walking all the way to the United Nations. We had a number of groupings that came, that was part of it, poor and homeless groupings. And at night when we stopped and to rest, we had interchanges from different groupings and different experiences. We had the MST, they had a delegation there. We had a group, an unemployment group from The Hague, from Europe, that was there. Quebec Unemployed Group was there. But then we had a number of groups like the Homeless Union, Coalition of Moxie Workers, Farm Workers out of Florida, they were there. But these various groupings that was part of that march at night would give a presentation on the lessons that they learned through that. And so based on, again, the experience of the Homeless Union earlier, and based on this experience, a group of us got together and say, look, we need to institutionalize this educational process as part of our organizing. And somebody said, why don't you call yourself University of the Poor? And we said, oh, that's an oxymoron. University of the Poor, they don't go together. And we said, okay, yeah, we'll go with that one. And so we initiated the first iteration of it as a educational arm of the first effort to reignite Dr. King's Poor People's Campaign. We call it the Poor People's Economic Human Rights Campaign. This was early on with the first iteration. At our founding convention at the University of Temple, we had Tony Mazzocchi, who helped form the Labor Party that keynote the founding of the University of the Poor at that stage. That was in 2000. And then we decided to re-establish it about 5 or 6 years ago. And at this time, we see we've developed a curriculum to develop revolutionaries, having people have a strategic orientation about who we're up against, who we are, and to have an outlook that appreciate the problems that we're dealing with. And when you're dealing with poverty and homelessness and all the different expression of it, you're dealing with questions that has to do with the nature of the system. And if you're going to resolve those problems, you got to change the system. And to change that system, you got to have leaders who understand what that system is all about, the nature of it, and how we have to get at not just the leaves of the problem or the branches of it. We got to get at the root causes. And so having a institution like the University of Poor to help exchange experiences, learn from history, learn economics and the things that Tonny mentioned. This is a part of our curriculum. It's absolutely indispensable. If your enemy knows A to Z and all you know is A, B, C, you don't get your ass kicked. Then what's the point? Huh? And so I think, I know you understand that. I mean, and, learning from, the Young Patriots, the Panthers, the first effort of Dr. King to launch the Poor People's Campaign, learning about the Reconstruction, and looking at historical parallels of other social movements that can help inform our efforts today is what constitute our curriculum at the University of Poor. We have a lot of a growing core of leaders who are committing their lives to the struggle to unite the bottom and to change this country from the bottom up. We've come to realize you can't change it. To change it, you can't change it from the top down because it don't change. And you can't change it from the middle up. You got to change it from the bottom up. That's starting with the most exploited and oppressed elements of society and the leadership and leaders that are emerging from that. So anyway, the University of Poor brings together people who are organizing among these sections. And we have a curriculum that goes into economics, philosophy, all the different areas of understanding that we need to grasp if we're going to develop the intelligence that's going to allow us to be practically effective. So that
that's really amazing.
Tonny, you might and having people like Tonny tells the story of his life and the lessons that he learned and what he knows, and we have others that we've worked with over the years. Good people, good quality people. I love to introduce them to you guys. Some of them look just like y'all. I thought y'all the same collective. Everybody, we all look alike. So we might as well get together and learn from each other, exchange experiences and stuff like that.
Sure.
I'll stop there. Maybe Tonny, you had some more to say about the University of Poor or other things you think, points you want to raise.
Well, just to emphasize that if we don't understand how the system works, and we're just out here struggling in these individual issues, then nothing's ever going to change. Our children, our grandchildren, 50 years from now are going to be facing the same situation, or worse. And the only thing, that's why education is is critical, and we concentrate on that. One of the things that we studied, and Willie and I go back to, it was 1975,
Yeah.
is what we're seeing today is results of things that were being put into place way back then when it comes to production. Now, there's really been a revolution in the way production is taking place with the use of robots, artificial intelligence, computers. And one thing that we saw is that this just isn't technology that makes it easier for workers or labor saving devices. It's labor replacing. And in just about every industry, we can see this taking place. Ford Rouge plant, I was able to go on a tour of that back in '72. And something like 50,000 workers there. And now it's down to something like 15,000. And so this is what Willie is talking about when he says those on the bottom, those that have been, they're not just temporarily unemployed. As far as this system goes, they're permanently unemployed. Well, they never will see a full-time job. And they never will have it as well as their parents did even. Yeah. And I believe it was Dr. King that said the most revolutionary individual is that one who has absolutely nothing to lose. They can't be bribed with a job or a house or whatever, because all these things are being taken away from them.
Yeah.
If I can, I'd like to follow up on a couple of those points. If everybody can hear me, okay.
Yeah.
I do think one of the things that's really interesting is you just mentioned some of those kind of numbers, especially in like labor movements. I mean, we're seeing now this kind of minor resurgence of things like the IWW is starting to rebuild. But I mean, obviously at its peak, there were 175,000 members. Now I think they run 2,500 maybe globally, which is like pretty kind of paltry numbers as far as like organizing labor movements. So what kinds of, I guess what would be the word here? What kind of like tips or what kind of, wisdom would you want to kind of tell people, like your average worker who maybe is in a Walmart or a Sam's Club or some other place that has like these, like an Amazon warehouse, right? That has these really aggressive kind of anti-union sentiments. What is the strategy for getting people to understand that everything they're seeing about anti-union work is all propaganda from the rich, right? And it's all designed to keep them basically weaker and poor, right? Because a lot of people, they've started to develop that mindset of like, oh, well, no, I mean, I don't need dues. I'm capable of like fighting for more money. I get paid what I think I'm worth. I mean, the number of people I've talked to who make $8 an hour and believe that that's all that they're worth and that's all they should ever get paid is astronomical, right? So how do we overcome that?
Well, this is precisely the question that we are grappling with today. And I was a trade union organizer in the plants there, in the steel plants, and having to confront these kinds of questions of where do you start, as well as the homeless union organizing. And one of the conclusion has been this principle that we call Muhammad has to go to the mountain, because the mountain ain't gonna come to you, Muhammad. The mountain being the people. And what we found is that you got to confront people on the basis of the issues and problems that they're dealing with. And that we learned that there's a difference between problems that are issues and problems that are not issues. When I was organizing in the steel plant, what turned out to be an issue that some of us began to really organize, and that we built a whole group out of it, was the issue that we were in a steel plant and we was wearing beard. All of us had fashioned a beard, and so for some reason this particular manager of this section developed this arbitrary ruling that we couldn't wear beards. And that angered us. It was something that dishonored us. They treated us like kids. And that was the issue. Now, there was all kinds of other problems in that plant. The ventilation, the working conditions that exist in that steel plant. But it turned out at that particular moment, it was the indignities of having people to tell us how long our beard should be. And so we did sit-ins, we did everything that people were prepared to do. We didn't stop there, but we started there and we built on that basis. So the question of identifying issue with the homeless in Chicago, for example, we brought the brothers and sisters from all the shelters from different parts of Chicago there. I'm just giving you an example. We did this for every city when we organized. We brought them in and we talked about what are the problems that you're dealing with and what are the major issues. And we were looking for the problems that were issues and that we could start with, and not the problems that were non-issues, that people wasn't most agitated about. And so it turns out that after we went around, and we had people from the Coalition for the Homeless, they were not homeless themselves, but they were working with homeless and they wanted to work with us. And they had a lobbying campaign down in Springfield, Illinois. They were carrying through a housing lobbying campaign, and they had proposed that, look, you guys are homeless. We got this lobbying campaign around housing. We got buses. We can have you guys go down with buses, and we can help give strength to our lobbying campaign down there in Illinois. So we heard that along with other proposals and other discussions of other problems. But what it turns out, for the most part, that what people were most agitated by the issue, or the problem that was an issue, was that every morning between the hours of 5 a.m. to 6 a.m., people have to get in line to get 5 sheets of toilet paper. They knew that they were in a shelter, and that they was in a shelter because they were homeless, and they knew they were homeless because of the job situation and all that. But what most aggravated them, what most agitated them, was the fact that they had to suffer the human indignity of getting in line to get 5 sheets of toilet paper. So that's where we started. And we started the discussion about organizing, about what the problem is and how these problems were related to that, based on those issues that people were really concerned about. And that's why you got to have leaders who really understand the root, the branches, and the leaves of the problem, so that you can, when you go to talk to people, you talk to them about issues that concerns them, that agitate them, that they have questions about. And having people who are able to answer those questions is very key. But so I don't know, I think especially in these times when issues are beginning to proliferate all over the place in relationship to coronavirus, race to job loss, you've got to proceed like that. And just in Detroit, we organized a union, a local of the Union of Homeless. Most of the members were former auto workers. They were homeless, and their issues was connected to their homelessness, the food issues. And so we used the issues that most aggravate people to start a discussion about how we should begin to do something about that issue. And today, with our in Salinas, we have a union chapter there made up of farm workers. Salinas is the lettuce capital of the world in California. It's called the salad bowl capital. And they've developed the technology to the point where these high-powered water pushing machines that are bombard the lettuce crop to a point where it could pick the lettuce by that means, that technological means, and it required less than half of the workforce that they had before to work in that plant. So a number of our members of the Salinas Union of Homeless are used to be farm workers and used to harvest that lettuce. And so the issues connected to that problem are the issues that we start talking to people about. And then as we talk to them, they're prepared to hear, look, let's do something about it. Because most people who are in those situations they're trying to resolve those situations. And that's what, a lot of our organized, especially the University of Poor, a lot of our leaders, they're coming from that section of the working class that's in very dire strait. They're hurting from homelessness, from healthcare issues, you name it, getting in these long food lines now. We're, doing agitation and education around those kinds of issues. I don't know, Donald, is that getting at your question?
Yeah, so I do. I think that there is, I think, something really powerful in that, in which when you were talking about organizing, I think focusing on those cases of dignity or even those indignities, right, can be super powerful. I remember before I moved out of Alabama, I was working at a little, like a small retailer that had been dealing with a ton of problems from how the employees felt they were treated. The pay was abhorrent. People, felt like they were working a $30 an hour job for like minimum wage, right? And you could never really get people to get on board with having any conversations about kind of collectively arguing for more money.
Right.
But one of the things we were able to fight for is that, most of us had either, tattoos of some sort or a piercing, or, in our particular store, we happened to have 3 different Black employees who were told that basically all of their hairstyles were considered, like anything that would be a traditionally Black hairstyle was considered unprofessional, right? So those were all those types of things where it was like this kind of infantilizing of like, like you're, like all of these, you have a tattoo or it's like, oh, you got an earring or, oh, you had braids in your hair. You're clearly a child. You need to be disciplined for those things. You could get people kind of truly riled up about in a way in which pretty regularly we could have kind of a collective meeting and have, 24 of us kind of yelling at management, every 2-3 weeks about like, hey, y'all need to fix this policy. This isn't acceptable. We're going to just keep breaking these rules because, these are stupid rules or whatever. And so I do think like, yeah, had I probably still been there a little bit longer, that probably, and then obviously now having the hindsight of having gotten to listen to you, that would have been a much better thing to try and organize around, other than the fact that you're all basically working for peanuts and your labor is absolutely being exploited.
Yeah, the lesson for us is that getting to know who we're dealing with and all the issues what are the issues and what their concerns are. That's critical organizing, and I think that this principle of Muhammad has to go to the mountain is the principle that sums up the way we've organized and the way we've educated. If you come from some ivory tower, with your idea about what has to happen. I know I was asked to come in by my brother I knew that I worked with, Dave Green. He was working in West Virginia, and they had a problem around layoffs that was taking place there, and he had met a number of the workers, and he was trying to organize them. He asked me to come in, and I came in there just naive with the idea of the 30s, and we're going to set up an unemployment council and so on and so forth. And I went in there with that point of view, as opposed to the fact that what they were, unemployment was definitely the problem, but the issue for them was the sewer tax that the government began to put on people because the revenue had charged me because of the unemployment. But the sewer tax was what they was arguing about. So we had to organize around that. And then we had to talk about where does that come from, how it's tied to unemployment, how it's tied to society and stuff like that. But the most important thing is that Mohammed got to go to the mountain, because he hold a meeting. Ain't no mountain gonna come to a meeting. You got to go to where people are at and talk to them about their issue, get to know them, have them to trust you, and engage yourself in their struggles. And then out of that, you find out how to talk to people and how to win them. And once you start organizing, like we do with the Homeless Union, then we can talk about the history of other organizing, so we can learn from history about our organized, perfect it, that kind of thing. So the key is hooking up with the people, linking up and being with them, living with them, and getting a feel for what their problems are. It's so important. I know.
Yeah.
That to me, I can tell you.
I do think there is something. I think there's something super valuable in that, right? And it's that about having those conversations with people about where they are, right? That distinction that you keep making between what the problem is and what the issue is, I think is really valuable. I notice it's a big issue that we're having lately on the left when we try to organize in all kinds of different spaces is you get those, it's the kind of what I would call the modern kind of academic Marxist-Leninist, right? Who's going to come out and just like go into a crowd of
I know a lot of those
illiterate coal miners and yell at everybody to read theory. You know, why aren't you reading the manifesto? Why aren't you reading this? Why aren't you reading? And like talking to them about wage slavery and this, that, and the other thing. And it's you're having a conversation with somebody where you're really just kind of talking down at like their problems, but you haven't even kind of gotten to the brunt of what their issue is. Like, what is the thing that's like? Wages can all make our lives better, right? Like of course. Our life would just be better if somebody handed us $1 million, right? Like we pay all your bills, you don't have to be hungry, like, but because we know that that's never going to happen, right? There's a point in which like money alone can't solve your problems. You need additional things. You need that kind of solidarity. You need the dignity. You need those tools to better kind of push you forward to ensure that, like, if money comes, like, it doesn't just immediately go away again, right? Like, you need to have those kinds of those options away. So I think, that kind of discussion there on problems versus issues is an excellent way to really kind of like drive that wedge and say, hey, look, like, how do we? Here gives us two different ways that we can tackle this problem moving forward. So I'd love to hear, Tonny, what, like, if you've got something else to kind of pile on to that.
Well, y'all are familiar with the Amazon plant in, I believe it's in Bessemer, isn't it? It's organizing now.
That is correct.
Yeah. We, the Poor People's Campaign was contacted by some of the workers and organizers there. And the problems that they were running into, I mean, you talk about getting people to support a union. The companies are even on their company time, are pulling people off the line and preaching to them as to why they shouldn't be joining the union. They go in the bathrooms and close the door to the stall. There's a sign there. They were passing out literature at the entrance of the plant, which I understood was on public property, but there was a traffic light there. So when the light turned red, they passed out the literature. The company then went and got with the city to recalibrate the light so that when they approached the light, it would turn green and nobody's stopping there anymore. All those are a lot of lessons that can be used, I believe, to help educate the people.
Yeah.
When the Amazon plant came in down here, they were talking about how they were going to be paying $12, $15 an hour. Well, they wouldn't let people work more than 20 hours a week. So it comes out to $750 for a whole week. And but it's it's these kind of issues that can also be used to educate people as to the relationship between the companies and the city, the company and the police, etc. We did that when we were organized in the poultry plants in Forest, Mississippi. And but one thing, and this may not be the best place to put this in, but I grew up on a small subsistence farm in Mississippi. And the small farmers, black and white, were being put out of business because they couldn't compete with the plantations once the plantations started using the cotton picking machines and these huge tractors that would plow 8 rows at a time, etc. And people were being tracted off the land. You had this great surplus of workers. They'd been working in the agriculture with no place to go. At the same time, you had companies moving lock, stock, and barrel from the north to get away from the unions, moving to the south, because after World War II, I think it's about 1947 or so, every southern state had passed right to work laws to make it more difficult to organize. Plants after the civil rights movement here in Alabama, plants would not move into the Black Belt area, which folks could really use those jobs and all, because they felt like with all the organizing that went on during the civil rights movement, they would be more likely to organize into unions. And now you see a lot of the plants that have moved in and then moved out have left these toxic waste dumps in poor neighborhoods. Just looking at the overall picture, there's a lot of practical ways. In addition, most important, doing what Willie's talking about is just going and talking to the workers, building up those relationships, finding out what they're concerned of. But there are a lot of other issues too that we could use to help educate people. The police not your friend, when you're organizing a union, and there's a whole history of that. But they have ways of intimidating people. And when we're faced with a situation today where, I don't know how it is up in Huntsville, but down here, jobs are scarce, really. And if people got a job, they're doing everything they can to hold on to it. So it's going to take some work, some education and all, to show them why they do need to organize into a union.
Can I ask a couple of questions? Speaking of, first of all, of Amazon, I mean, the issue there is not so much money, it's the way people are treated. They ruin their bodies by, going miles and miles every day, have to take Tylenol every morning and every night. They have no bathroom breaks worth a day. I mean, even their breaks, they have to go half a mile to get, to take a break. The other thing it seems to me is one of the issues is, that's really condemns the system, is that all these advances that save labor impoverish people instead of giving them more leisure and more time to do what to do things that are more rewarding than work. When you touched on it a little bit, but the question I have is, it makes sense, obviously, to talk to people about exactly what their issues are. Like I say, with Amazon, if you talk to Amazon workers about you're not getting paid enough, that's not as powerful as talking to them about the indignities they face. My question is, how do you then relate that to other struggles in other places so that people organize across the lines as opposed to in individual locations? Because, I mean, unless there's mass resistance,
Yes.
You're not going to really, accomplish anything lasting.
Yeah. I think, David, you're asking a question of strategy. How do we now, deal with the causes, and how do we organize to deal with the causes? How do we build a mass movement? And I think this is precisely the issue that the University of Poor is trying to grapple with. Because in our work with the homeless, we're realizing that unless we're talking about creating some kind of charity for the homeless, which we're not, and we're talking about ending homelessness, that no matter how many homeless people you organize, you're not going to have the kinds of numbers or mass to really end poverty and end homelessness. So you need a movement. And so organizing the homeless has got to be in concert with organizing other sections of the poor and dispossession of the working class, and which is necessitate the leaders of these various fronts of struggles coming together, putting their heads together, strategizing, and coordinating their efforts to build a massive movement. And I think it's going to be very important that a historical perspective is brought into that process, because you look at history of successful movements and how these movements have succeeded and how they've grown. They've developed through stages. And you got to be able to appreciate the stages of the development of social movements. I mean, you wouldn't tell a mother, after she hears from the doctor that she's pregnant, to get on the bed and start pushing. I mean, the baby don't come out of the womb, running the 100-yard dash like Usain Bolt. I mean, they crawl before they walk. Things go through stages. And sometimes the way we approach things is not strategic. We don't see things in terms of stages. And so we miss where's the starting point. And the history of successful movements are the history of how the initial stage of that movement was one of identifying leaders. We call it panning for gold. And everything that glitters is not gold. In the course of these struggles that you're waging, you want to be able to identify the leaders and to train and educate them so that you can build the movement off that. If you don't complete that first stage, you're not going to get to the next stage of really building that mass movement. What's more, what we've learned, like especially with the experience of the Watts Uprising, is that movements develop in spurts. They don't, there's long periods of quiescence where you're getting ones and twos and threes, and then there's massive dislocations. And the key is, how do you develop in periods where you can, where you have this more quiescent period, or things that are relatively quiet? How do you identify the gold pieces, the leaders, so you can position yourself to absorb this tremendous amount of growth? That's one of the problems during the 30s and a lot of these movements, is that you had this massive dislocation and you didn't have the leadership to absorb this tremendous number of people. And I think this question that you raised, David, in terms of building a massive movement, is to understand history of stages of movements and understand what stage we're in. We're basically still in the beginning stages. And what we've learned through our network and through the Poor People's Campaign, what we're doing and so on, is that spaces like this, where you identify leaders and have this kind of discussion, is absolutely necessary to develop, to learn from different struggles, and to know that you got to really engage people and be prepared to organize them on their terms and not your terms. That's what Mohammed Go to the Mountain is all about. I was organizing the plant, or I was asked to organize the steel plant. And what you want to do when you start organizing in a plant is identify leaders so you can establish an organizing committee. And in this one plant, we was organizing, and the most articulate workers in the plant, they didn't join in the organizing. We wanted to put them into the organizing committee, and they didn't want to organize. They made suggestions here and there, and if you call a meeting, they came to a meeting. But it was clear that they were the leaders, and we couldn't get them onto the organizing committee. It turns out that these leaders, these folks, they were leaders of the local NAACP, and they were dealing with eviction of their members outside the plant. And if we would have been able to relate to them in terms of what they were doing, we could have recruited them and brought them back and be leaders within this other struggle. But since we was only thinking in terms of the plant issues and not the other issues and what people are dealing with, we missed that opportunity to bring in these more advanced leaders into the organizing effort. So having places like this where we can exchange these experiences is going to be absolutely important. The other thing I think is very important is building the kind of collective out of which leaders are developed. And this is what these kinds of things does. It allows you to cross-fertilize experiences, learn from each other, and learn how you approach things. And I know with the Homeless Union, what we had done, every time we would go into a new city to organize, we would have a time when we sit down with the brothers and sisters and talk about other experiences, what we did in other cities, what was most successful. We exchanged experience, we created that kind of environment. And then out of that discussion came a kind of reconnaissance teams where we had people go out and look in different areas of the cities to really get an estimate of the problems or what are the possibilities of struggle that we want to take up, and what are the problems we want to try to solve in terms of organizing. And there's one city, Austin, Texas, when we went in there, we was asked to come in, and we sent a delegation into the city, and we sat down with the leaders who had called us in to talk about the experience we had in other organizing drives in other cities. And we looked at all the problems that existed, and we set up our reconnaissance team. And we had one team go to the historic district of the downtown, because what you had was a homelessness that was just blatant. I mean, you had mothers and their babies in these hovels, no larger than a doghouse, right in the parking lots, in the alleyways, in the downtown areas. It's blatant, and nothing was being done. And so that's why the brothers called us in and say, how do you guys organize? They heard we've been organizing the Homeless Union. How can we organize the Homeless Union here? So we looked at all those conditions. We set up a reconnaissance team to go find out more data about the problem so we can figure out exactly where we're going to start that organizing drive. And one of the teams, like I say, went to the historic district where you had these collections of mansions that were the buppies and yuppies and buppies and tourists would come and go see somebody in history took a shit or something and it became famous or something, I don't know, in one of these goddamn mansions. And so so they got all the information about those that historic district. Then we had different places that people went to, these reconnaissance teams, but one team went to the city council and got a copy of the city budget and see how the problems of homelessness and people in these houses and in these hovels, mothers and their babies, why are they there? And how was that reflected in the budget? Well, they looked at every item of the budget once they got a hold of that budget, and they saw indeed that there was no allocation in terms of any item of the budget toward people who get laid off and they lose income and then they become homeless. And there was no provisions for that in the budget. But they did find this one curious thing in the item in the budget. This was in the 80s, in 86, 87, around that period. And they found that that there was this item in the budget of the purchase of Canadian geese at the tune of $800 per goose. All those geese you guys see flying around all over the place, they used to have to pay for them bad boys. And so we found that crazy item on the thing in the budget, but no budget item, allocated for people, human beings. But they bought in these geese so that the yuppies and the buppies can do lunch, and throw breads at the geese and stuff during lunchtime. So based on the information that we gathered,
there was a creativity that came out of that discussion in terms of how can we bring attention and break our isolation and really launch the organizing drive in Austin, Texas. So we came up with this action, and the action was that we moved into one of the mansions. We took over the mansion. And we called the police, and we knew that the police had this relationship with the local press because they get a lot of their stories. The press get a lot of their stories from the police. So the next day, when they decided to come, they came rushing over in the direction of the historic district with the police cars and the newspaper van, news covered vans come. You could hear the sirens coming over in the direction of the historic district and they drive up and rode up right to the mansion where we had took over the mansion building. They jumped out of their cars with the cameras rolling, with the guns out. They came out. The police came out with the guns. They came up, they knocked on the door and says, "Come on out of there, we know you in there." And one of the brothers, homeless sisters said, "We know we in here, we called you." So about 30 seconds elapsed, about 30 seconds or so elapsed before soon you hear the big giant door of the mansion begin to creakily open. And there stood a homeless brother and a homeless sister with one of the goose by the neck. They had kidnapped one of the goose, and they had a knife at the goose's neck. And they said, "If you take one more step closer, this goose is cooked." And they was able to hold the media for weeks, and we had press conferences, and we had trade union leaders come to our site. We had religious leaders come. We broke our isolation. We set up a support network, and we started the organizing drive based on that. That came from collectivity. That came from learning from other experiences. That came from, a certain bravery and leadership that was exhibited during that process. And in every city that we organized, there was different issues upon which we launched the thing because there was different situations, but the creativity came out of the collectivity of the process. And if we're going to build a mass movement, we got to learn from these kinds of experiences. And that is because we're dealing with the most disunited, most segregated, most disorganized sector of the population when we talk about the people at the bottom. And they are purposely disorganized and disunited. I mean, that's how the powers that be are able to manipulate the poor here to go fight each other or go fight the poor in some other country, because they have to keep us disorganized. And if we're going to move this thing toward ending capitalism, we got to resolve this problem of our disorganization. But that's largely an political education question that's tied to the work. I'm not talking about academic education. I'm not talking about this fiddling while Rome is burning kind of education. I'm talking about an engaged education, engaged intellectualism that start from where people are at and not where they ain't at.
Yes. That raises another question, actually. I've given some thought to that. Things have changed since, Marx and Lenin were writing. There's not the same industrial proletariat.
Yeah.
Factories can be diffused. There's no center because every computer has all the information. And that really does sort of disunite exploited people. And that's another question, is how do we change tactics to address that change?
That's a great question. I don't know, Tonny, you want to deal with that? I certainly got something to say about that. But that's a great question. And that's precisely what we're dealing with the University of Poor, is having people to think. I mean, like you said, Marx is dead. Lenin is dead. I mean, we are here. We got to deal with this problem. And we got to learn from them and learn from others that have been, especially the ones been successful. But we got to be able to have people who can think through these problems and develop the kind of creativity that the homeless brothers and sisters in Austin developed at that point, because they was able to launch their organizing drive, break their isolation, and go forward. So, and they wasn't trade union. They wasn't in a trade union. They wasn't in a plant. They was out there in the goddamn streets. you know. So, and they're just as much part of the working class as anybody else. They don't have no money. They don't have no property and ownership of any kind of a Walmart or a bank or nothing like that. They got to go find a job to work like anybody else. So how do you organize under those circumstances? It requires tremendous thinking ability and creativity. And I think, I mean, don't let me go on that one, because that's exactly what, I meet a lot of so-called academic Marxists, man. Marxism is like a religion to them, and not a kind of a method of analysis of thinking. It got us where we don't think, man. And you need to think right now, because the situation is not what it was in the past. That's for damn sure. I mean, Tonny, I want to take it away, but
Yeah. I just want to say something that we're running over time.
I'm sorry about that.
If people have to go, they can go, but we can stay, and keep the conversation going, so still, feel free to, if you have other commitments, to leave, but if you want to stay, we can continue and for a little while.
Okay. I see that Colleen is here. Hey, Colleen.
Hey, y'all. I'm sorry to be late.
you are.
Colleen, I prepare. I see your face. Still that ugly ass that picture you sitting at. I'd rather see your face.
Yeah.
It's a nice picture, a nice caricature, but they don't look nothing like you, lady.
Well, good to be that.
Yeah.
God, both of you got blonde hair. That's about it.
So quick question for
Hey, yeah, you are. See there?
quick question for either Willie or Tonny, whichever one of you thinks it might be better to answer this. Willie, you'd mentioned earlier that you'd had in that kind of conversation the concept of like the panning for gold, looking for leaders, right? Not all glitter is gold. We've seen a lot in what I'm going to call recent history. So let's call it 2012 forward, right? So let's just call that our recent history, right? So we're seeing a lot of movements in progressive organizations and various people running for office, these types of things, stuff like the Squad, the Cory Bushes of the world, like all these different groups. I'd even Stacey Abrams out there in Georgia, right, where you have these movements where these leaders kind of emerge, and then 6 months later they've folded into that establishment, right? So how do we, as we kind of pan for that gold, how we dig for those leaders, how do we help prevent them from just being co-opted by the thing that we're fighting against, right? How do we keep leaders like on our team, so to speak?
You want to address that?
Well, it's my understanding, and Willie, correct me if I'm wrong, that Stacey Abrams was part of the Council on Foreign Relations, before these elections in Georgia. And if anybody's familiar with the Council on Foreign Relations, it's like the think tank for the bourgeoisie, and it has all different kinds of people on it.
Yeah, it's basically the organization that determines who we're going to coup next around the world. Like
That's part of what they do too.
Yeah. The other thing, trying to address some of David's question, if I'm going to be betting on a boxing match that's going to take place 20 years from now, and I have two fighters to choose from, am I going to put my money on a 25-year-old today, or am I going to put it on a 10-year-old? And when we look at the growing number of homeless, I know we've said this over and over, what is going to happen then when the moratoriums run out? And a lot of these people are going to be evicted. And that's going to be a growing number right then. And it's not only where we need to pan for gold, but we have to educate as we organize. We learn in the struggle. The struggle really is a school for us. And I'll punt it to Willie. He's much more articulate than I am.
Oh, no.
Real quick on that too, though, because I think there's something interesting in that, Tonny, where when we think about these moratoriums and some of the things that are coming, right? Like we now in this conversation, we've seen, those of us who are trying to organize, we see the storm coming, off the shore. But there's a lot of people out there who, they're just, I don't know if it's a head in the sand issue, if they're just really, that blind faith hopefulness that they're going to somehow, the storm's going to pass over their door. But there does seem to be a lot of cases where, Ellen used to call it the concept of the temporarily embarrassed millionaire, right? People don't think that they're poor. They think that they're a temporarily embarrassed millionaire, right? And they're any day now, like that paycheck's going to come through, that shit's coming in. Right. So how do we kind of talk to people in a way where it's like, no, like, I know you feel like you're okay now, or like this is going to blow over, you're going to be fine in the end. You're not going to be fine. Like you're this close to sleeping next to that guy with the shopping cart. Like we need you. Like, how do you build that kind of, what's the word I want to use here for, that intensity, or that kind of like need to go right now feeling?
I mean, I think some of the experiences that we're having around the Poor People's Campaign and some of the organizing drives that are taking advantage of the kind of environment that the Poor People's Campaign is setting, and also from history, I think we got to draw from some of those experiences to answer that question. I know there's a lot of reference to the Civil War and Reconstruction these days because the crisis itself seems to be much more systemic and much more chronic, and with these large, somewhere 25 million people been given their unemployment check, and you look at these huge lines. I mean, we're looking at tremendous dislocation. So people are looking back in history to go to have lessons. Now, what we're finding, a lot of these young leaders and our new leaders, our education system has totally left us ignorant when it comes to history, and particularly economic history. And so we don't really understand the times and how explosive the times. And we have very little historical knowledge of what in history have been some of the parallels. Like, for example, the period that preceded the Civil War was a period in which everything polarized. The churches polarized. The temperance movement polarized. The military polarized. In fact, that's what the Civil War is. It polarized. Everything polarized. And you look at other social movements that gave rise to fundamental change, they were prefaced by this period of polarization. And this is the period that we're going through right now. Everybody's having to make a decision as to what is their position around what's going on today. And I think understanding that becomes very, very important in terms of how we're going to influence people and move and build this mass movement. The other thing, if you look at that period, that you had a cadre that understood that all the problems, whether problems of foreign policy, problems of race, problems of gender, role of women, and so on, was connected to the fact that it was the slave power and slavery that was the cause and need to be dealt with. And that they formed into the abolitionist churches, abolitionist societies. And they began to identify among all the polarities and struggles, the one that was most key, that really exposed the nature of the problem. And that was these slaves running away in the Underground Railroad. They was able to, by moving them, they was able to move the entire country. In fact, the Civil War eventually became a war to end slavery, largely because those Underground Railroad was transformed into army units of black slaves that then really shook up the thinking of people about their attitude toward slavery and toward particularly blacks. They thought, and in every movement, and this is where education come along. That's why, I mean, this is where me and Hyde, we all hook up on this question of education, because every movement ended the oppression first in people's thinking before it was ended in fact. The slave mentality had to first be ended in order to end it in fact. In other words, consciousness. But consciousness grows out of the struggle and the experiences. And when people were experiencing the slaves in the Underground Railroad running away, along with all the other struggles, the boycott of slave product and all that kind of stuff, their consciousness was affected, and the abolition was able to build on that, a consciousness that took the country through the Civil War into Reconstruction, which was which ended in the exchange of power, actually the overthrow of slave power that came out of that process. Of course, the consciousness wasn't to the point where they was able to prevent Wall Street from benefiting, industrial and financial capital concentrated there in Wall Street. They couldn't prevent them from emerging eventually and taking control of the country. But the exchange of power from slave power took a movement that took advantage of the polarizations that began to take place at that time, and to identify what was the key polarity and what was the key movement that was going to help move the consciousness of the people. And I think if you look at history is replete with social movements that, if led by those that are most exploited, and those people that were most exploited was educated and organized, that movement came to a successful conclusion. But when the struggle against the British crown, it had to be led by the people who were in the colonies. They had to lead that struggle, or the struggle around slavery had to be led by those who were affected by slave power, the slaves and the poor whites who was moving into these free states to homestead. They have to be at the forefront. Can you imagine the struggle for women's suffrage led by men? Nothing would happen. And so I think understanding what the problems are today and what are the sections of society and what is the polarity that most express that problem and who is most oppressed about it is where we got to start to identify leaders and build leaders. And I think that's very, very important. And then lastly, what we learned with the Homeless Union is that when we talk about panning for gold, everything glitter ain't gold. That's why you got to engage people to find out who's who and what's what. Because when we formed the Homeless Union in Chicago, we had a very articulate president that was elected because he worked hard and he was very articulate. And so the homeless brothers and sisters elected him as the president of the Homeless Union, the Chicago, Gary, Indiana Homeless Union. And they had their first protest, but before they had their first protest, they couldn't get anybody to step forward to become the vice president. And so there was this one homeless brother who had who wore this 3-piece suit with one of these attaché cases, and he looked the part, man. He wore the same suit every day, but he carried himself in a very, sophisticated manner. And they say, "Hey, man, why don't you be the vice president?" He said, "Sure, I don't care. I'll be the vice president." And so when they had the first action, the president got sick, and so he couldn't be there for the first action. So the vice president took over. And so what happened was the media came up to get some kind of explanation as to why the protests and what they were trying to accomplish. So they went to this brother in the suit. They say, "We understand that you're the vice president." He said, "Yeah, I'm the vice president." He said, "Why are you guys out here? You guys trying to get a job?" He says, "A job? I ain't trying to get no MF job. What are you talking about?" Goddamn, he was cussing. Every other word, man, was MF this. Man, I'm a hustler, man. I ain't getting no goddamn job, And we were like, "Whoa, man!" And we were scared like we were really scared, and that when the TV aired, they didn't air him because every other word was MF, MF, MF. We was, but everything glitter ain't gold, you know, and so finding leaders is so key, because the leaders is the one that wake people up, is one that teach people. You got to be there with people to raise their consciousness. You can't be from a college campus throwing some books at somebody and think some consciousness is going to grow. You got to be there with the people, and that means identifying leaders from the ranks of the people. And that's the way, I know that's the only way you're going to organize around homeless people, because you're not about people who are constantly moving around. You got to have their leaders who are part of that process. And so knowing that what glitter is not necessarily gold is so crucial, I'm telling you.
Okay, well, I think we've about reached the end here. And Willie, I just want to thank you, and Tonny, thank you for coming on and sharing all your knowledge. And
I appreciate
well, I tell you, we've learned a lot from it too. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us, guys.
Want to see how now, we can work together. NASO can work with you folks.
Definitely.
And hopefully getting some classes going or supporting your actions and that kind of stuff. So we really do appreciate it, and appreciate everybody else that came on here too. Okay. All right, folks.
All right.
Hey, thank y'all.
Hey, you guys. Be safe. Everybody be safe.
Thank you, Willie. We appreciate you. Thank you, Tonny. Thank you all so much for coming and
Thanks, y'all.
chat with us.
Thanks for listening.
Fireside Chats is a production of North Alabama School for Organizers. NASO seeks to empower communities through intersectional education and training. More information, including upcoming classes, at naso.network. Thank you for joining us for Fireside Chats.